Moscow, May 9, 1945. Victory Day. The streets erupted in celebration as the Soviet Union marked the defeat of Nazi Germany. Red flags waved from every building. Soldiers embraced strangers. Vodka flowed like water through the jubilant crowds. But in a quiet apartment on Arbet Street, far from the revelry, a British man sat alone at a wooden table, his hands trembling as he unpacked a leather satchel. Inside were documents that could reshape the balance of power between East and West, code books, cipher keys, intelligence assessments, secrets that belonged to His Majesty's government. James Hartley, one of Britain's most celebrated codebreakers, had just committed the unthinkable. He had defected to the Soviet Union, and MI6 had no idea until it was far too late. This is the story of how a hero became a traitor, how trust became betrayal, and how one man's disappearance exposed the fragility of the intelligence world at the dawn of the Cold War. What drove James Hartley to abandon everything he knew? Was it ideology, love, fear, or something darker that no one could have predicted? The answers would haunt British intelligence for decades. Let me take you back to where it all began. To a time when James Hartley was not a defector but a rising star, a genius, a patriot, or so everyone believed. Bletchley Park, England, 1942. The war was at its darkest hour. Nazi U-boats prowled the Atlantic, strangling Britain's supply lines. German forces pushed deep into Soviet territory. The outcome hung in the balance. And in the sprawling estate of Bletchley Park, hundreds of Britain's brightest minds worked around the clock to break enemy codes. Among them was James Hartley, 26 years old, thin, bespectacled, with dark hair that always seemed slightly disheveled. He had arrived at Bletchley in early 1941, recruited straight from Cambridge where he had been studying mathematics. His professors had described him as exceptional, though socially awkward. He preferred equations to conversations, patterns to people, but at Bletchley, those qualities made him perfect. James was assigned to Hut 8, the section dedicated to breaking German naval enigma codes. The work was grueling. Each day brought thousands of intercepted messages, encrypted strings of letters that seemed random, meaningless. But James saw what others missed. He could spot anomalies, recognize patterns in the chaos. His colleagues marveled at his intuition. It was as if he could think like the German operators themselves. By 1943, James had become indispensable. He worked 18-hour days, fueled by black tea and cigarettes. His supervisor, Commander Edward Denniston, called him the finest cryptanalyst of his generation. James helped develop new methods for attacking enigma variants. His breakthroughs saved convoys, prevented ambushes, shortened the war. He should have been celebrated, but James Hartley was not interested in glory. He barely spoke during staff meetings. He declined invitations to the pub. He lived alone in a small cottage near the estate, cycling to work before dawn and returning after dark. His only companion was a tabby cat named Turing, after the famous mathematician. People assumed he was simply dedicated, obsessed with the work. No one suspected what was really going on inside his mind. The truth was that James Hartley had a secret that, if discovered, would have destroyed his career and possibly landed him in prison. James was homosexual. In 1940s Britain, this was not just taboo. It was illegal. The law classified it as gross indecency, punishable by imprisonment or chemical castration. James had known since his teenage years, but he had learned to hide it, to bury that part of himself beneath layers of mathematics and duty. At Cambridge, he had been careful. A few stolen moments with another student, nothing more. At Bletchley, he remained isolated, terrified that any slip might expose him. He had heard the rumors about Alan Turing, the brilliant mathematician who led much of Bletchley's work. Whispers that Turing was different, that he had unusual friendships. James admired Turing immensely but kept his distance, afraid that association might draw suspicion. The fear was constant, a shadow that followed him everywhere, and it made him vulnerable. In the spring of 1944, everything changed. Bletchley Park had begun working more closely with Allied intelligence services, including the Soviets. The USSR was Britain's ally against Hitler, and Churchill had agreed to share certain intelligence to help the Red Army. Soviet liaison officers were stationed at Bletchley, carefully monitored but present. One of them was a translator named Alexei Volkov, 32 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp blue eyes and a disarming smile. Alexei's job was to translate intercepted German communications related to the Eastern Front. He worked in a separate building but occasionally crossed paths with the British cryptanalysts. James first noticed Alex in the canteen one afternoon in April. Alexei was sitting alone, reading a book in Russian. James, who had taught himself basic Russian out of curiosity, recognized the title. It was a collection of poetry by Alexander Pushkin. On impulse, James approached. "Excuse me," he said quietly, "is that the Bronze Horseman?" Alexei looked up, surprised. "You read Russian?" "A little," James admitted. "I find languages fascinating, structure, patterns." Alexei smiled. "Then you understand poetry is more than words. It is music, rhythm, emotion." James felt something stir inside him, something he had suppressed for so long. They began talking about literature, about mathematics, about the war. For the first time in years, James felt seen, understood, not as a codebreaker, not as a tool, but as a person. Over the following weeks, James and Alexei met regularly, always in public spaces, always careful. They discussed philosophy, argued about politics, shared stories from their childhoods. Alexei spoke of growing up in Leningrad, of the revolution, of his belief in a better world. James found himself drawn to Alexei's passion, his conviction. But more than that, he was drawn to Alexei himself. The way he laughed, the way he listened, the way he looked at James as if he mattered. One evening in June, after a long shift, Alexei invited James to his quarters. "Just for tea," he said, "to continue our conversation." James knew he should refuse. Knew it was dangerous, but he went anyway. In Alexei's small room, surrounded by books and maps, they talked until midnight. And then, in a moment of reckless courage, James confessed the truth. "I have never told anyone this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I think you might understand. I am not like other men." Alexei did not flinch. He reached across the table and placed his hand over James's. "I know," he said gently, "and it does not matter to me." That night, James felt something he had never experienced before. Acceptance, love, hope. But he did not realize that Alexei Volkov was not just a translator. He was an officer of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, and everything that had happened between them had been carefully orchestrated. The NKVD had identified James Hartley months earlier. They had studied his file, noted his isolation, his lack of close relationships. They had recognized his vulnerability, and they had sent Alexei to exploit it. The poetry, the conversations, the intimacy, all of it was a trap. But Alexei had not expected to feel anything real. He had seduced men before, extracted secrets, discarded them. It was his job, but James was different, intelligent, kind, genuine. Alexei found himself conflicted, caught between duty and something he could not quite name. Still, orders were orders. In July 1944, Alexei began asking questions, subtle at first, about James's work, about the codes he was breaking, about British intelligence operations. James, blinded by affection, answered, not everything, but enough. He told himself it was harmless. The Soviets were allies. Sharing information helped the war effort. But deep down, he knew he was crossing a line. By the autumn of 1944, James was providing Alexei with classified material, copies of decrypted messages, details about Enigma weaknesses, information about British intelligence priorities. He justified it as helping the Soviet Union defeat Hitler. But the truth was simpler. He was in love, and he could not bear to lose the one person who made him feel whole. Alexei passed everything to his superiors in Moscow. The NKVD was delighted. They had turned a British codebreaker, one of the best, but they wanted more. In December 1944, Alexei received new orders. Prepare Hartley for exfiltration. The war was ending. Soon, the alliance with Britain would fracture. The NKVD wanted James in Moscow, where he could work for Soviet intelligence permanently. Alexei told James the truth one cold evening in January 1945. He confessed that he was NKVD, that their relationship had begun as an operation. James was devastated, betrayed. But Alexei insisted that his feelings had become real. I was sent to manipulate you, Alexei said, his voice breaking. But I fell in love with you, and now I am asking you to come with me, to Moscow, where we can be together, where you will be safe. James was torn. Part of him wanted to refuse to report Alexei to salvage his loyalty to Britain. But another part, the part that had been lonely for so long, wanted to believe. In Moscow, Alexei promised, no one will care that we are together. You can work. You can live freely. Here you will always be hiding, always afraid. James thought of his life in Britain, the fear, the secrecy, the knowledge that if his secret was discovered, he would be destroyed. He thought of his family who loved him but did not truly know him. He thought of the future, stretching out gray and empty, and he made his choice. In April 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final days, James began preparing. He copied documents, gathered intelligence, made arrangements. MI6 suspected nothing. James Hartley was a hero, a trusted officer. No one imagined he could be a traitor. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. Bletchley Park erupted in celebration. Champagne flowed. People danced in the halls. But James Hartley was not there. He had already left, vanished, gone. MI6 discovered his disappearance 2 days later. His cottage was empty, his belongings gone. A search of his workspace revealed that classified documents were missing. Panic set in. Commander Denniston was summoned to London. How could this have happened? How could one of their best men simply disappear? Investigators traced James's movements. They questioned colleagues. They searched for clues. And slowly the truth emerged. James had been seen with Alexei Volkov. The Soviet translator had also vanished. The pieces fell into place. James Hartley had defected. The scandal was enormous. MI6 scrambled to assess the damage. What had James taken? What did the Soviets now know? The agency launched a desperate effort to contain the fallout, but it was too late. The information James had provided gave the USSR critical insights into British cryptographic methods. It compromised operations. It exposed vulnerabilities. And it signaled to Moscow that the British intelligence services could be penetrated. James's family was devastated. His mother, a schoolteacher in Yorkshire, refused to believe it. There must be some mistake, she insisted. James would never betray his country, but the evidence was undeniable. His father, a retired army officer, was humiliated. He told neighbors that his son had died in the war. It was easier than the truth. James's younger sister, Margaret, was the only one who suspected there might be more to the story. She had always sensed that James was hiding something, though she never knew what. She wondered if he had been blackmailed, if he had been coerced. She refused to accept that her brother was simply a traitor. In Moscow, James Hartley began his new life. He was debriefed by NKVD officers who extracted every detail of his work at Bletchley Park. He was given a new identity, a new apartment, a new purpose. He was assigned to work for Soviet military intelligence, applying his skills to break Western codes. Alexei was there, as promised. They lived together quietly, discreetly. In the Soviet Union, homosexuality was also illegal, but the NKVD protected its assets. As long as James was useful, he was safe. But the life James had imagined did not materialize. Moscow was cold, gray, oppressive. The initial excitement faded. He missed England, missed his family, missed the person he had been before everything fell apart. And Alexei, once passionate and attentive, grew distant. The man James loved was consumed by his work, by the demands of the NKVD. Their relationship became strained. James realized too late that he had traded one prison for another. He had escaped the fear of exposure in Britain, but he had lost his freedom. He was a defector, a traitor, a man without a country. The Soviets did not trust him. His British colleagues despised him. He was alone. By 1947, James was deeply depressed. He requested permission to write to his family, to explain, to apologize. The request was denied. He was a Soviet asset now. His past life was over. In 1950, James Hartley attempted suicide. He was found in time, hospitalized, and placed under closer surveillance. The NKVD could not afford to lose him. He knew too much. He was too valuable. But he was also broken. Back in Britain, MI6 continued to investigate. They wanted to understand how James had been turned, what had made him vulnerable. The answer, when it emerged, was deeply uncomfortable. James Hartley had been blackmailed by his own fear, by a society that criminalized who he was, by a system that left him no choice but to hide or be destroyed. Some within MI6 argued that the agency bore responsibility, that by failing to protect officers like James, by allowing fear and secrecy to fester, they had created the conditions for betrayal. Others dismissed this. James Hartley was a traitor, they said. His reasons did not matter. But the case haunted British intelligence. It exposed a vulnerability that would be exploited again and again throughout the Cold War. Homosexual officers, terrified of exposure, became prime targets for Soviet recruitment. The Cambridge Five, Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, John Cairncross, Anthony Blunt, all of them in different ways were shaped by the same forces that had consumed James Hartley: fear, secrecy, vulnerability. In 1967, Britain decriminalized homosexuality. It was too late for James. By then, he had been living in Moscow for over 2 decades. A ghost, a footnote, a cautionary tale. James Hartley died in Moscow in 1982. He was 66 years old. The official cause of death was heart failure, but those who knew him said he had been dying for years. Slowly, quietly, consumed by regret. Alexei Volkov had left him in the 1950s, reassigned to another operation. James spent his final decades alone, working on minor cryptographic projects, largely forgotten by the Soviet intelligence apparatus that had once prized him. He never returned to Britain, never saw his family again. His mother died in 1960, still believing her son had been coerced. His father passed in 1965, bitter and silent. Margaret, his sister, spent years searching for answers. She wrote letters to the Foreign Office, demanding information. She hired private investigators. She traveled to Moscow in the 1970s, hoping to find James, but Soviet authorities denied he was there. It was not until the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that Margaret finally learned the truth. Russian archivists, sifting through declassified NKVD files, found James Hartley's records. They confirmed his defection, his work for Soviet intelligence, his lonely death. Margaret was in her 70s by then. She read the files with tears streaming down her face. Her brother had not been a monster. He had been a man, flawed, desperate, trapped by a world that gave him no way out. She published a memoir in 1998 titled The Codebreaker Sister. In it, she argued that James Hartley was not a traitor but a victim of a society that criminalized love, a victim of intelligence agencies that exploited fear, a victim of a Cold War that consumed everyone it touched. The story of James Hartley raises questions that remain relevant today. How do we balance national security with human dignity? How do we protect those who serve their countries from exploitation? How do we ensure that fear and secrecy do not become weapons turned against our own people? James Hartley was a brilliant man, a hero who helped win World War II, but he was also a human being with needs, desires, vulnerabilities. And when those vulnerabilities were exploited, he made a choice that destroyed him. Was he a traitor? Yes. Did he betray his country? Yes. But was he also a victim? That is the question history must answer. The Cold War was fought not just with weapons and spies, but with fear. Fear of the enemy, fear of betrayal, fear of difference. James Hartley lived and died in that fear. And his story is a reminder that the greatest intelligence failures are not always about stolen secrets or broken codes. Sometimes they are about the people we fail to protect, the lives we fail to understand, the humanity we fail to see. Today, James Hartley is remembered, if at all, as a footnote, a name in a file, a cautionary tale in the history of British intelligence. But to his sister Margaret, who never stopped searching for him, he was something more. He was a brother, a man who loved and lost, a man who made a terrible choice but who deserved to be understood, not just condemned. And perhaps that is the real lesson of James Hartley's story, that behind every act of betrayal there is a human being. And that understanding why people make the choices they do is the first step toward preventing those choices from being made again. The Cold War is over, but the questions it raised about loyalty, fear, and humanity remain. And the ghost of James Hartley still whispers a warning from the shadows of history. What would you have done if you were trapped between who you were and who the world demanded you be? If you were offered a choice between loneliness and betrayal? If you were James Hartley, standing in that Moscow apartment on Victory Day, unpacking secrets that would change your life forever, would you have made a different choice? Or would you, too, have vanished behind the Iron Curtain, hoping to find freedom in a place where none existed? These are the questions that haunt us still. And they are the questions that make James Hartley's story not just a tale of espionage, but a tragedy of the human condition.